Hi everyone, welcome to Bible Blast and Lesson 14. We are continuing with Jacob in his journey toward Haran. He came to a well, and there were men gathered around the well with their flocks. So he said to them, "Do you know who Laban is?" And they said, "Oh yeah, we know him. In fact, here comes Rachel with the sheep. Rachel is his daughter." And so Jacob went to Rachel and he identified himself. He said, "I am your father's sister's son, Jacob." And so Rachel ran to get her father. And Laban came out and he greeted Jacob and he said to him, "You are bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh," which basically meant that he was family. And there is Rachel, and you can see that she is very beautiful. And so after a month, Laban said to Jacob, "What would you like your wages to be since you're working for me?" And Jacob says, "Well, I love your daughter Rachel. I would like to work for you for 7 years so that I could marry her." And Laban said, "Well, I can't think of anybody better to marry my daughter." And so that's what happened. Jacob worked for Laban for 7 years so he could marry Rachel. And it didn't even seem like 7 years because he loved her so much. It just seemed like a few days. Well, there was a big wedding feast, and at night when it was dark, Laban tricked Jacob. Instead of sending in Rachel to him, he sent in Leah. And of course, he had no idea. Jacob didn't know that it was Leah instead of Rachel. And so he married Leah. And in the morning when he woke up and he saw that Leah was in his tent, he went to Laban and said, "Why did you do this? I worked for Rachel." And Laban said, "Well, it's our custom to marry off the older daughter first. But you know, if you'd like to have Rachel as well, all you have to do is agree to work for another 7 years." And Jacob said, "Well, yes, I would like to have Rachel as my wife, so if I can have her as my wife, then I will work for another 7 years." And so that's what happened. Now Jacob had 2 wives and he had to work 7 more years. Well, after he had worked for Laban for 14 years, then he worked for 6 more years so he could get some flocks for himself. Now Laban kept on changing the rules, but whatever Jacob did, God blessed. Laban would notice that there were some spotted sheep, and so he would say, "Well, there's only a few. I'll let Jacob have those." So he said to Jacob, "You can have all of the sheep that are spotted." So what would happen is then more spotted sheep would be born. And Laban would notice that and he'd say, "Wait a minute. I should have the spotted sheep since there's more of them." So he'd say to Jacob, "Never mind. I'll take the spotted sheep. You can have all the striped ones." Well, then God would make it so more striped sheep were born. And that's what happened all the way through for 6 years. So that Jacob ended up with some really good flocks. Now Laban's sons were getting very angry, and they said amongst themselves, "Look at all the flocks that Jacob has taken from our father." And Jacob noticed that Laban wasn't as friendly toward him. And so he called his wives and he said, "Your father has cheated me so many times. And God has blessed me and he has blessed Laban as well because of my being here. But he said, God has told me that I need to go back to the land where I set up an altar to him." And so they said, "You should do as God has told you." And so he gathered his wives and their nurses and all of the children he'd had with them and all of his flocks, and he left without telling Laban. So Laban was off shearing his sheep, and somebody told Laban after 3 days that Jacob had left. Well, Laban was very angry, and he came with all of his men, and he went charging after Jacob, and he finally came up to him. But God warned Laban in a dream and said, "Don't you do anything to hurt Jacob." And so when Laban finally came to Jacob, he said, "What did you do this for? I would have given you a going away party, but you just left with all my daughters and all of my grandsons. And why did you steal my gods, my images?" Well, Jacob knew nothing about that, but it was Rachel, his wife, that had taken her father's statues and hidden them. And so Jacob says, "Go ahead, search the tents," because he really didn't know anything about these images. And Laban searched and he couldn't find the statues. Well, Rachel was sitting on the statues. And when her father came into her tent, she said, "Is it okay if I don't stand up, Father? I'm just not feeling good today." And so Laban didn't find the images. And Jacob said, "What are you doing, making all this fuss? I've taken nothing from you." But the two men made an agreement that they wouldn't hurt each other. And so they built up a big pile of stones, and they swore in front of the Lord that neither one of them would pass the pile of stones to hurt the other. So Laban kissed his daughters and all of his grandsons, and he went back home. Jacob sent messengers ahead to Esau to let him know that he was coming. And so Esau said to the messengers, "Okay, I'm coming. I'm going to meet Jacob with 400 men." And they brought that message back to Jacob. And when he heard it, he was so afraid. He thought, "Oh, Esau is going to kill me." So he got an idea that he would split his flocks and give half of what he had to Esau as a gift, hopefully making sure he wasn't angry with Jacob anymore. And so he split up all the horses into two groups. And he split up all of his sheep into two groups. And these sheep too. That one talks. And his bulls he split up into two groups. And all of his cows. And he sent men ahead with these gifts. He thought, well, if Esau does something to one group, then the other group will survive. But he said to the men, "Take small groups of flocks, and when you meet Esau, you tell him, 'Oh, Jacob's coming back there, and these are a gift for you.'" And he thought, if every servant that Esau meets will say that, by the time Esau gets to Jacob, he won't be mad anymore. And so Jacob sent all the men ahead with all the flocks. And he was by himself, and he prayed to the Lord that the Lord would preserve him. Well, the angel of the Lord came, and he wrestled with Jacob all night. And in the morning, Jacob said to him, "I'm not letting you go unless you bless me. I'm not letting you go." And the angel of the Lord said to him, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have wrestled with men and with God, and you have prevailed." And so after that, Jacob split up the nurses and his wives and all the children. He had the nurses that belonged to his wives and all the children he'd had with them in front. And then he had Leah and all the children that she had had with him. And then finally Rachel and the one son, Joseph. So he had 11 sons at this point. But he went ahead of all of them. And when he saw Esau coming, he bowed to the earth 7 times to show respect to his brother. And Esau ran to him and he embraced him and he hugged him, and they were reconciled one to the other. So they had forgiven one another. I'm going to show you some pictures here. This is the picture of Rachel sitting on her father's idols. And there's Laban and his men and sons checking out the tents, looking for those idols. And there's the angel wrestling with Jacob, the angel of the Lord. And on this page, we see the servant telling Esau that Jacob was coming with all these gifts. And finally, we see Jacob bowing down to Esau. And so they were reconciled. Now, Rachel had one more son, and his name was Benjamin. So now Jacob had 12 sons. We will be hearing more about those 12 sons tomorrow. Please make sure you come back. Bye for now.